Good afternoon. Welcome to the Archaeology of Connecticut. I'm Glenda Rose, President of Friends of the Office of State Archaeology, here with State Archaeologist Dr. Sarah Sportman and former FOSA President Scott Brady. Today's program features a discussion of our upcoming field season, so on this dreary day, you can all look forward to this summer's interesting digs. I hope to see many of you at our sites and encourage newcomers to come out and join us. No one should worry about being inexperienced, since that's why we hold these field schools where you can team up with an experienced person who will teach you all the proper techniques. Also, some of us are getting older and can't get down in the dirt like we used to, but there's always something you can do, such as screening or helping with paperwork. And I'd also really encourage photographers to come out and take some photos for us. We love that. Yeah. Lastly, I want to thank Scott for doing such a wonderful job of managing the fieldwork season. We have other regulars who are also indispensable. Joan Hill and Lori Kessel both keep things running smoothly every day. I know I'm missing many names as I can't be out there every day, but I usually see Ed Goodrich, Mike Cahill, Dick Hughes, Sandy DeStefano, Jim Trokey, Paula Morris, and many others. In fact, most of the FOSA board is out there, so thank you all. Now here we are. On to Sarah and Scott to start the conversation.
Thanks, Glenda. Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining us this evening. So, as Glenda said, this month we thought we'd focus on the upcoming OSA FOSA field season and talk about some of the research projects, excavations, and collaborations we have on the docket for this summer and the fall. To help us with that, we have a guest on the phone, Dr. Dave Leslie from TerraSearch Geophysical and Heritage Consultants, who's working with us on the remote sensing, primarily GPR aspects of several of these projects. Dave's been on the show lots of times before, talking about various things from Paleo-Indians to GPR. So, hi, Dave, and welcome back to the show.
Oops.
We have a busy field season planned this year with projects in Glastonbury, Bolton, Hebron, and East Haddam. These sites span the human history of our state from Connecticut's first people in the Paleo-Indian period through the colonial period and into the 19th century. We also have several collaborations that we're really excited about, including working with Dave on the geophysical side of things, as well as collaborations with the University of Connecticut's Archaeological Field School, the Two Wrasslin Cats coffee shop, and the State Library's Digging into History program.
I would like to say that, a month and a half ago we were looking and saying, let's have a nice quiet summer.
Yeah.
It'll be a little slower than usual, and we've already been out twice and have most of the summer booked. I don't know how that happened.
Yeah, I think this is what passes for a quiet summer for us. I think we should start, though, before we start talking about the plans for the summer, why don't we spend a little bit of time talking about the project we just finished up in Wethersfield at the Hurlburt-Dunham House.
Sure, that's a good one.
Yeah, so last week we were out at the Hurlburt-Dunham House in Wethersfield. We did a small archaeological survey there for the museum.
Technical difficulties.
Yeah, we're having minor technical difficulties. So the house is a museum run by the Wethersfield Historical Society. It's situated on Main Street, and it was built back in 1790, and it's across the street from the Webdean Stevens Museum, where a really significant archaeological discovery was made in 2017 that we've talked about on the show.
Right, some of the original settlement structures from the early or mid-1600s.
Yeah, so back in 2017, identified a section of a 17th century landscape with preserved sections of palisade, as well as many domestic artifacts related to the 17th century household of Clement Chaplin, who was one of the founding residents of Wethersfield. And we've talked a lot about that project here on the show in the past, but knowing that was there across the street really raised the potential for archaeological significance at this other property, which is why we went out there to do the survey. So the Hurlburt-Dunham House is planning to repair their porch and install a new access ramp at the back of the house to increase accessibility. And we went out and dug a series of 4 test pits in the location of that ramp. And boy, were they deep.
I was just going to say, it was almost Templeton deep, and those were the deepest test pits I've ever been involved with. I think we're 130, 140. And for those of you who have never dug a test pit, it's only 50 centimeters, so it's a little over a foot by a foot. Try to dig a hole a foot by a foot down 4 feet and keeping the walls nice and straight and clean and everything. It was difficult. But I want to say the material culture that we found was pretty surprising. I think the biggest thing that I took away from it was the house there. Oops. We're still working on getting Dave. The house is built in what we say 1790, and the material that we found spanned a much earlier time period than that, right through up to about 1790.
Yeah, we found 17th century materials for sure. We had a variety of the artifacts that we found on our other 17th century sites, including a section of a German stoneware Bellarmine jar, some Westerwald, some Delft, some English yellow slipware, and a variety of older looking redwares that are very typical of the period. We also found a bunch of 18th century materials that predates this house. And the fills were incredibly deep, as Scott said, about 4 feet deep. And it basically, and at the bottom of that, we actually found the intact ground surface.
Right. Right. So again, for you people that, maybe are avocational or just getting interested in archaeology, someone had taken all kinds of material, put it on top of the original ground for building up where the house currently sits by about 3 feet. And by looking at the soil profile and the colors and the textures, we were able to determine that the actual ground surface, the original ground surface, let's put it that way, was had been covered with 4 feet of material. And that's the material that contained all these interesting artifacts.
Right, and the idea is that fill was probably coming from somewhere nearby in the early settlement area of Wethersfield. So they're actually probably building up the site with some of the older sites. But the intact ground surface below is really significant because it suggests that there is still potential in that part of Wethersfield to have other portions of that early colonial landscape preserved. And that's really significant. And we did find some really interesting artifacts when we were out there.
Yeah, one of the things, the ones that I think struck everyone, because, right, you find a coin, it's super exciting. And to find a silver Spanish real, 1787. So just about the time the house is actually being built, in gorgeous condition, was really neat. And some of the questions that we were asked about that was, why a Spanish coin? Are pirates running through, Wethersfield dropping their coins? And I think that a lot of people don't know that early on in the colonial period, even on into the early period for the U.S. history, there's a shortage of coinage. There's a shortage of currency here. So pretty much any kind of coin from any country, or even tokens from pretty much anywhere, are being used as currency here in the colonies and then later on in the States. So a really cool coin that kind of is contemporaneous to the house being built. Yep.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, it was a really small survey and we just, we're really testing in the footprint of that ramp. But the take home was that there's a lot of potential for that property. And part of the reason why we did this survey was so they could have that information for future planning. So if future renovation work is being planned around the house or in the yard, it's really important to take into account that these deposits can be buried there and that they'll need archaeological investigation.
And I think that that's, a message that has been resoundingly felt over the last several years, of places where you didn't think these kinds of really early sites could survive, that they're out there. The Hollister site, the Mason site, the Webdean Stevens, the Hurlburt. Now, we're finding all these little slices of sites that I think a lot of archaeologists thought were gone. The Ryan Jones site, right? 14,000 years ago, or 12,000 years ago. That I don't think people thought they were there anymore.
No, I think that lots of times, the idea was that so many of these sites were just either inaccessible or gone, or they'd been, blown out by development or washed away by erosion. And we're just finding that if you are persistent and you test enough and you, sometimes it's possible to still find these things, and they're shedding all kinds of new information on the past.
Yeah, that's kind of neat. That's my takeaway from that the Hurlburt site.
Yeah, so I kind of want to wait to talk about some of the stuff we had planned until we can get Dave on the phone to call in and talk about the ground penetrating radar. But maybe we could just start talking about our plans for the Hollister site this summer. And then maybe if we can get Dave on the phone, we can do the GPR section at the end.
Sure. I'm going to spend a lot of time at Hollister again. That's for anybody listening that hasn't heard us talk about Hollister, which would be pretty hard to do. That's our continuing research site. We've been out there since 2015. Nick Bellantoni was out there. Brian Jones was out there. Sarah's continued the work that's gone on out there. It's a early farmstead. It's part of Wethersfield at the time it's that they're out there. We know they're out there on the property from about 1650 going forward. The place that we're working, kind of the occupation there ends at around 1715, I think.
Yeah, that's the safe.
John Hollister, the son dies, and then the area's just abandoned. The cellar holes are filled in, and we go on from there, and it's become farm field, and it becomes a horse pasture, and no one ever bothers it. So it's been nicely left intact for us.
Yeah, and it's incredibly well preserved. And I know that some people might wonder why you would go back to the same project year after year, after year, like 7 years. But it's an incredibly complex site. And it just has so much information about the 17th century in Connecticut colony. And we're just really starting, I think, to scratch the surface of what this site can tell us. So this year we're going to be out there for a whole month between May 22nd and June 23rd. And for part of that time, we're going to be collaborating with the Yukon Archaeological Field School. It's going to be under the direction of Dr. Kevin McBride, and we'll be working with him to help train the students and also, get that extra labor, I guess, if we're going to put it bluntly.
Right.
But it's a great opportunity for students to learn about, a whole range of material culture, because this site really has everything. Dave, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, great.
Thanks for having me.
So,
Thanks for being so patient with us.
Yeah, I'm going to just kind of back up and say welcome back to the show. Glad that we could have you on again. We're going to just sort of talk about Hollister first, and then maybe we'll talk about some of the other projects. So we were just kind of setting up the field season and what we were going to do, working out there with the Yukon Archaeological Field School. We're also going to be running a field school for the Archaeological Society of Connecticut for members the last week of the field school. And so, if you're interested, you could always join ASC and join us out there.
And then we'll be back again for a week in August doing a field school for the Connecticut State Museum of Natural History at the Hollister
That's
site.
right, which is another program that we're running in collaboration with them. So, this site is such an important part of Connecticut history, but it's also such just an intriguing place to work because the preservation is so good. And we have been out there for a long time, but we really have some intriguing recent discoveries from the last couple of years that are driving our research goals for this site, trying to better understand the complex interactions of politics, economics, and social life in the 17th century here in Connecticut colony, particularly the interactions between English colonists, indigenous people, and then also other English colonies in the greater Atlantic world. And we actually have pretty solid historical and material evidence that we have connections to all of these things at the site. It's also a great site for ground penetrating radar, which is why Dave is here today to talk to us about that. Can you talk to us? Remind us. I know we've done shows on GPR and talked about it before, but can you give us just sort of a brief reminder about what ground penetrating radar is and how we use it in archaeology?
Sure. So ground penetrating radar is what archaeologists or geophysicists refer to as a remote sensing technique. That means that we're able to use a machine to take a look at an archaeological site or potentially underground utilities, right? When you think of like dig safe or call before you dig, they're often using ground penetrating radar to map where buried utilities are. Archaeologists are using it to try to map where interruptions in the stratigraphy or the layers of earth are so that we can target archaeological sites or maybe features. And the Hollister site is a really great example of the use of this technology. It's one of It's one of the best examples, I think, because it was investigated before GPR with not much fanfare, right? So there were some investigations that were done via test pitting, which is the traditional way that I think you were all talking about before. Maybe you're digging Wethersfield where you're doing test pits. And, that's a great way to do archaeology unless you've got a giant field and limited time, right? And so Peter Leach, then a graduate student at the University of Connecticut, did a GPR survey for the previous state archaeologist, Brian Jones, and found several buried cellars in the soil stratigraphy. And so what he did was he drug a machine across the surface of the field where it's firing an electromagnetic pulse or radar that's traveling down from the machine. It speeds up or it slows down depending on the soil layers that are there. When it speeds up, it sends some radar back to the antenna. When it slows down, it does the same thing, and then the machine is continuing to move, and it collects what we call a profile, a stratigraphic profile of GPR. You can use a number of different programs to stitch those together and then look at a map in 3 dimensions from the ground surface going down 3 feet, 4 feet, 5 feet. And the tighter you collect your data, so the closer your intervals of collection are, the better your data will be. And that's what really separates a lot of the GPR specialists that are archaeologists from other GPR specialists out there who are doing the sort of utility locating services that I talked about. And so, as I mentioned, the Hollister site is a really fantastic example because the soil stratigraphy is so amenable to GPR. And it's not only Peter's work. There have been successive graduate students from the University of Denver under Larry Conyers, Maeve Herrick, Jasmine Saxon, and now Sindel Grosskopf, who've all done a lot of other great GPR work out there to help the Office of State Archaeology and FOSA really find a lot of these features, and so they can spend less of their time looking for the features and just beginning to investigate them too. So that's sort of a quick idea of how it works and the best practices I think that archaeologists are using these days for collecting the data.
Yeah, and it's been great at Hollister and other sites too, which we'll talk about going forward, where instead of, as Dave was saying, instead of trying to just do a test pit survey and systematically covering an area and hoping that you find the spots where the archaeological deposits are buried, this actually lets us find them ahead of time and then target our excavations to do things like expose the houses that were there in the 17th century or investigate, the cellar fills and the pit features and things like that. So it's a much more targeted approach, which is great for us because we only have like 4 weeks every summer to spend on this site.
I think the other thing that it does, right? I mean, if you for anybody that's been out and dug test pits, right, you have to pick an interval. You can't dig a test pit, and touch them all together and just keep digging them. So you have a spacing between them, and oftentimes that spacing is large enough that you could miss a house or a native settlement, right? I mean, so the GPR really kind of helps find things that probably would otherwise be lost, even if we were out there testing.
Sure, and I'd just like to underscore, too, with Hollister, and now that OSA and FOSA have done so many excavations, it helps ground what these things look like. We know what a well looks like in GPR to begin with, but cellars and houses can be quite different depending on the construction techniques, particularly here in New England where they span the 17th century into the 19th or 20th century when we're looking at them. And so it's not a perfect tool. What we can often say as a GPR specialist is, hey, there's something here that's really interesting, and then it requires archaeologists to come behind and do that ground truthing. Now, whether that's with test pits inside of it or trenching or large excavation units, it's only with that ground truthing, with pairing the archaeology with the GPR, that we can start to really see what these images look like in real time with GPR and get a better handle on what they might be, too.
Yeah, and it's been great at Hollister because we do have a variety of different architectural techniques that are present on the site. We have earth-fast construction from the earliest structures where, houses or other buildings have cellars, but they don't necessarily they're not stone-lined or anything like that. This is like post and ground construction. And we also have stone-lined cellars and structures that were probably framed, and a variety of other features, as well as some pre-contact indigenous features. So looking at all this information from the GPR and then ground truthing it, as Dave said, really helps to refine understanding of what features do look like in GPR, so it can be information to use going forward when you're surveying other sites. So it's really become kind of a really important tool in the archaeologist toolkit for survey, for that first step to help kind of target some of these sites. So this year with the ground penetrating radar, we're kind of building off the past work, and we've got a couple of areas that we want to go back to and get some new data. So we know from the documentary record that the Hollister site was at least partially fortified at the time of King Philip's War in the 1670s. And we don't know what that means. We don't know how much of this site was fortified. We don't know if that means that there was like a palisade wall built around part of it, or if just like one of the house structures had like a fence put around part of it or was partially fortified. And that's one of the research questions that we have. And a couple years ago, we did find a long linear feature that was exposed at the base of the plow zone. We did not have the opportunity to explore it fully or to keep seeing or to see like the extent of it. So one of the things we want to do this year before we dig is go back with the GPR and see if we can relocate that feature and see if there is any indicator that it could be some kind of wall or fortification.
Right. See if it goes beyond the extent of our excavations, because that would be really telling that, it wasn't us just imagining things. For anybody that's looked for features in the ground, they can be very ephemeral, and it's a challenge to pick out sometimes the man-made or man-caused activities versus a tree throw or a burrow hole. So those lines can help us, and if that line extends longer, I think that would be really important for us.
Yeah, and it would be great if we could find a corner.
Yeah.
Right. I think just to follow up on what Scott says, challenge is maybe the nicest way of putting it. I've had some of the most interesting features I've ever found archaeologically in plan view, as you look at them as you go down, turn out to be a tree throw or something like that later on.
Yeah.
And it's been very, very disappointing.
It's true. But, another good aspect of this potential, if this is some kind of fortification or wall, one thing that we've been trying to figure out is like the chronology of this site and how it was used through the different periods. I mean, it was actually only occupied for 70 or 80 years, but a lot is going on there during that time period. There's at least 2 separate occupations. They might be using the farm in very different ways in those 2 time periods. Excuse me. And it would be great if we could find that wall, because it might clue us in to that time period of King Philip's War and what part of the farm was the most important and most in use during that period.
Yeah, in that 1670 period. I think that's important because, we have, 7, 8 cellars at least, probably, in a very small area. So there's something definitely unique and different. There's just too many to be 8 houses stuck in that little plot of land.
Yeah, and so the 1660s, mid-60s to the turn of the 18th century is the Hollister occupation of the Hollister site, where John Hollister Jr. is living there with his family. And, we know from the documents that he fortifies in some way. He asked for men to help fortify his house and store corn during King Philip's War for protection. At the same time, he's also offering land to help the local Wangunk Indians, like create a fortified village of their own nearby. And there's some indication that there's some cooperation involved in this and a relationship between the Hollisters and the local Native people at this time. And so that's really an interesting aspect of this and the nature of that relationship and how it plays out. But in the earlier part of the site, when there's another family that lives there, the Gilberts, there's a whole bunch of other really interesting historical processes at play that we've been trying to tease out. So this is a family that's involved in everything from the fur trade to the early West Indies trade, possibly with ties through family connections and business to the Chesapeake, to Delaware, which is interesting, which is sort of new information that has recently come up, and as well as the West Indies, so the whole basically Atlantic world. And we actually have artifacts that reflect those connections on the site. So really trying to understand all this is a big part of the research. We just recently, 2 years ago, we found a big hunk of coral, which was great and kind of started us on this path of like trade in the West Indies and all that. But just this year, we had another discovery.
Yeah. we did a float. So we collected soil sample and then we floated it later on from a feature. So you put it in water, you let the heavy stuff sink to the bottom and wash all the silt away. You let the light stuff float to the top. That's called light fraction. The stuff that sinks is heavy fraction. And then you take it and you can do all kinds of cool things with it. Someone can look at the light fraction and find seeds and different botanical things, corn, nuts sometimes, and kind of start to tell you about what kind of crops or what kind of foods are being eaten. And in the heavy fraction, for one of the features, we found this. Well, we're calling it a construction material. It doesn't quite look like daub, which is a old-fashioned or very old format of like weaving sticks together and then covering it with a specific clay. But it's a really flat, plaster-like material made of clay, and it has a lot of tempering in it. So they ground something up to make it stronger so it would last longer. And what we think is in there is ground coral.
Yeah, probably maybe a mix of shell and coral, but we think that there's coral involved in this. So we had this one chunk of coral that was just coral. But then out of one of these float samples, we found a couple of chunks of coral that's been burned. And burning shell and coral and things like that is part of the process. You need to use it for making mortar and temper for pottery as well. So that's really interesting.
And do you think that's something they would have bartered for, or they would have just been given that?
It's actually possible that it was coming up from the West Indies as ballast in the ships.
Yeah.
So if you're sending full ships down and they're not quite as heavy on the way back, you might balance that out with ballast.
Wow.
Yeah, and there's already, we know, a huge industry of going to get the ballast when it's the European flint coming from England, right, or other continental areas in Europe where they're using that flint to make gun flints, or here at the Hollister site, we know from a use-force specialist that they're using, potentially Native Americans on site are using the European flint in traditional Native American ways to make cutting tools, too. So there's already this connection of going to get the ballast material, and it looks like coral was just maybe another great thing to get, too.
Yeah, and I think, we should point out that, we're saying it like it's no big deal that we're finding native-made tools from stone that's from England. That's not a really common thing to find. So there's some relationship that appears to be a little different, or something's going on between the native people and the Hollisters or the Gilberts or both that is not understood. If it's going on, it hasn't really been found too many other places.
Yeah, and we have a whole bunch of material evidence that there is a contemporary indigenous presence on the site, and so that raises all kinds of questions about what the nature of those relationships are, right? What, how Native people are interacting with the Gilberts and the Hollisters on the site. Are they there in a cooperative fashion? Are they there in a coercive fashion? Post-Pequot War, and there's all kinds of captives and indentured servitude happening with Native people because there's a dramatic labor shortage in New England. But there's also a lot of Native people who are willingly selling their labor and becoming part of this, capitalist economy in this time period as well. And then you have all this tension between Native groups in the period between the two wars that could potentially have an extra added layer of maybe people are there for security, particularly during the King Philip's War period. So trying to tease all this out is another big part of the research program.
Yeah, I know.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
About all the cellars that you found? I know that you don't know why, but what are some of the maybes?
Well, I think cellars suggest storage of some variety. So I think that, we're thinking that the products coming from this farm might not just be for home use, that they might be on a larger, more commercial scale. And that with the family connection. So I should say that the Gilberts who are there, one of the brothers is married. One of the brothers is married to a woman named Amy Lord, who is the sister of Richard Lord, who was a major merchant in this time period, and other sisters married to Thomas Stanton, who's the interpreter and merchant, and they're involved in all kinds of trade, including Lord being involved in the early West Indies trade. They're involved with John Pynchon up in Springfield. So we think that they have these connections that could loop them into these trade networks. And part of this is also coming from the other archaeological data we have. We have all this animal bones, but they're not domesticated animals. We know they're raising cows, sheep, pigs on the farm, but they're not eating them for the most part on the site, which is really intriguing. So seem to be hunting, or somebody's hunting,
Right.
a lot of wild game. So that leads us to wonder if maybe those animals are one of the products that, they're shipping.
Yeah, I think if you showed an archaeologist the bones that are from Hollister, the meal, the food waste, right? Fish, turtles, deer, small mammals, they would say that that's probably a native site. But it's not. They're found alongside, European artifacts.
Right.
Yeah. We also have evidence that indigenous pottery is being made on site, because not only do we have pots, we also have found a clump of tempered clay, so the clay that's been prepared to make into a pot but not made into anything. So, it suggests that pots for themselves are actually being made on site, which again is indicative of an indigenous presence. And so that brings us to another aspect of the GPR. Several years ago, Brian Jones really had a feeling that there was an indigenous settlement area to this site, and he didn't locate it, but we're going to go back with the GPR to a couple of areas to reassess that that possibility. Do you want to talk about that a little bit, Dave?
Yeah, they're pretty so these areas that Brian was interested in are pretty shallow features. They appeared in previous GPR iterations to be circular, but that actually was an error in the way that the data was collected. They're actually rectangular, and we know that through additional excavation. So some of those turn out to be cellars, but some of them might not be, right? They haven't all been investigated. And what's really interesting is that there's been some magnetometry that's been done at the site as well. That's a slightly different remote sensing technique that works based off of the dipole magnetism of the way that the magnetic orientation of sediments, particularly magnetic orientation is enhanced in sediments that have iron in them that are burned. So when you burn soils or rocks that have iron in them, the magnetic attraction is more intense. And there are some areas to the south of the Hollister site that look interesting in GPR, and also have some peaks in their magnetics as well, which is potentially really interesting, right? They could be hearths, fire pits from Native American occupations. They appear to be somewhat shallow, right under the plow zone, so they could be of the right age too. The late archaic ones, I think we would expect to be somewhat deeper, based on this radiocarbon dating from the Hollister site suggesting that there's a pretty intense late archaic, or about 4,000, 4,500-year-old occupation there. But we would expect, because some of the sediments at the site are alluvial, so they're building up through time, right, that those would be somewhat deeper. And these appear in GPR to be sort of just under the plow zone. So probably they were in the plow zone too, but then later plowing has disturbed those higher settlements. So a really exciting area to investigate. And this is an area that Sindel Grosskopf, a current graduate student at the University of Denver, is investigating too.
Yeah, so before we go out in the field this season, we're going to run the GPR over this area again and try to refine the imagery from that to give us a better sense. And then we're going to do some testing out there with the Yukon Field School, and then hopefully open up an excavation block to explore this area, and we'll see what we find. So stay tuned, I guess.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
So for our listeners, I was always thinking that you would only use that equipment on the ground as we see it, but the truth is that you can dig your site and then use it again. Is that correct? And then dig some more and use it again? Does it work that way as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So traditionally, what most archaeologists or geologists have done is what you just said. You use it on the ground surface. You use a mid-range antenna, something that's about 400, 500, 600 megahertz. That's just the type of radar waves that you're sending, how powerful they are. But when you remove the plow zone and you expose a cultural feature, you can use a much higher powered antenna, 900 megahertz, or a 2 gigahertz, so an order of magnitude above the megahertz, right? And those don't provide you a very deep window into the soil. You only get about, with a 2 gigahertz antenna, you get about 1.5 feet, maybe 15 inches penetration. But it provides a really high-resolution way to look at cultural features, to give you sort of a digital bisection before you excavate it. And that's something that is becoming, I wouldn't say common in archaeology, but more and more people are using it. And we're indebted to some of the people at GSSI, like Peter Leach, who saw that other GPR specialists were using this type of technology to look at the strength of rebar in concrete. That's really where the GPR specialists make their money, is in concrete scanning, right, to ensure that our bridges and our construction projects are holding up to the standards that engineers have designed them to. That's what GPR is mostly designed for. And they use these high-powered antennas to look at the strength of rebar inside of the concrete. But luckily for all of us, Peter realized, and others as well, that this had really great applications to the archaeological record. And that's something that we've been doing at Hollister and some other sites, too, is when we expose cultural features, we then use these high-profile antennas to get a digital bisection to try to understand what they look like. We did it at the Brian Jones site in Avon, and we've done it at several others as well, to really great results for the most part.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. That was a great explanation.
Yeah, it's an exciting time because I think the equipment cost, it's certainly not pocket money, but it's a more accessible cost. It's much better than it was a decade or 20 years ago, and people like Peter Leach and a number of others have come up with some really interesting techniques that weren't available or weren't understood before, and now you can do a lot more with it, and it's a lot more cost effective too.
You know, it's kind of fun to think about 20 years from now what it will be like as well, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, we'll be flying them with a drone.
Yes. Yeah.
So I know we spent a lot of time talking about Hollister, and we could talk about it all day long.
No, we didn't even talk about wampum.
We didn't.
We probably should at least mention our
All right,
wampum.
we'll do that, and then we'll switch gears. Yeah.
So one of the interesting things, going into last summer, we had found several pieces of wampum on the site, probably about 6 or 10 pieces over, basically close to a decade worth of work there. And we did one cellar in 2 units, so 6 foot by 3 foot square, and found
must be 30 by now.
30 pieces of wampum.
Tell our listeners what wampum is.
Okay, so if you don't know what wampum is, it's a shell bead. So native people, long before Europeans get here, are making these shell beads, not so much as a currency, but I would say it's fair to say as a decorative element, as an element of trade, as an element of gifting. And they can make them into belts and decorative items and bags, and they're trading them, and they are a status symbol in some respects. So wampum is made from shell, quahog shell mostly, and you get a lot of white wampum. But on the quahog shells, there's a little bit of purple, right? If you get it at the right time, in the right season, and the right size. So purple wampum beads are like really desirable. So we found about 30 wampum beads in this cellar that we were looking in. We found the raw product, so the snapped pieces of shell that they would have ground down. We found the whetstone that they would have ground the shell on to get it into a cylindrical format. And we also found the little awl or drill that they would have used to hand drill out the little tubes after they created them. So again, we didn't just find wampum.
You're right.
You find wampum on a lot of European sites because it becomes a currency.
Right.
I mean, you see it listed in people's probate, European settlers. But when you find all the pieces of someone making wampum, then you start thinking something else is going on here. And we also found a couple pieces that were split while they were being drilled.
That is so cool.
So again, we have we have clay that was used to make pots, but it wasn't fired yet. We have wampum that is split while it was being drilled on the site. All these kinds of things that are leading to the idea that there are native people living on the site, contemporaneous to the our English settlers, and doing all the things that native people were doing.
Well, I love it because it paints such a great picture for us. You can actually watch it all happening in your mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is really neat.
And I think that the most, significant part about this, I think, is that one, it just provides a vehicle for just exploring the complexities of relationships in this period. And I think that, I don't know about you, but when I was in school in the 17th century, it was like there was pilgrims. Everyone wore dark clothes. It was awful.
You went to school in the 17th century? That's what that sounded like.
And then, when we learned about it, I guess, right? There was pilgrims. There was really dark clothes. They were really stuffy. And then they farmed. And then there was a revolution.
Yeah.
Like that was pretty much the whole story, And I think that it's such a rich and interesting time period with so many complex relationships between different colonial powers and indigenous people and settlers. And people don't really understand how much proximity people were in daily lives. Like native settlements and European settlements were side by side. People were, they were interacting all the time. There wasn't really a separation that was so distinct. And I think that, sites like this can really help us get a richer picture of life in that time period, because it wasn't cut and dried. It wasn't like good guys and bad guys. And it wasn't, everybody had complicated motivations and there was a lot going on. And I think that it's just a great launching off point for a more kind of nuanced understanding of this time period.
Yeah. And I think we all suffer from small world model from that time frame, right? Oh, everybody grew up and never walked more than 3 miles from where they were born. Right. But, the material that we're finding on this site, we have Dutch material, we have Spanish ceramics, we have German. The trade and the networking that's out there is much bigger than I think people think about when we think about, the 1600s or the 1700s.
Well, we're really
we should
flying
move on
through time.
to something else.
All right, so there's at least 2 more, if not 3 more sites we need to talk about. So I guess next we should really talk about, we can talk about this one kind of quickly, but we've had an ongoing project, and we really should do a show on it, actually, at the Two Wrasslin Cats Coffee House in East Haddam. And there we have evidence of a Paleo-Indian, 11 to 12,000 year old, either early to middle Paleo-Indian component right in the backyard of the Two Wrasslin Cats coffee shop, where we've been working since 2020. And actually, we've been collaborating on this project with Dave, who not only does GPR, but is also a Paleo-Indian specialist. So do you want to talk a little bit about that site, Dave? Because we're going to be out there for 2 days in May.
Sure. So the first thing that I would say is that the coffee and the sandwiches are great. Everybody should visit the Two Wrasslin Cats, coffee shop. But also, so it was a site that was found by our friend Mark Clymer. He was there having coffee, and there's a fountain in the backyard that has a bunch of cats around it, and they had installed a new electrical trench to it. Something happened where the fountain wasn't working, and when they installed that electrical trench, they apparently disturbed this pre-contact Native American site. And Mark, with his eagle eye, just having his coffee, bent down and picked up the flake, noticed that it was most likely Norman Skill chert, a type of high-quality chert that is found in the Hudson River Valley, that we find in other time periods here in Connecticut, too, not just the Paleo-Indian. But he then sent it around via email to some people, including Sarah and myself and others, and said, what do you think? And so we all took a day or two to go out and volunteer and start excavating. Mark had done some test pits before we got there, and so we started digging excavation units. The first, I think, day or two when we did the excavation units, we found a couple of end scrapers, which is a type of scraping tool that Paleo-Indians and other people, too, would attach to a piece of a long shaft of a piece of wood or maybe bone so that they could increase their pressure or their fulcrum when they were removing the fat and sinew from animal hides, think caribou or other large animals they're hunting, because it's very cold during the Paleo-Indian period, so they're cleaning all of those hides to make them into clothing or camping material. So, we found some end scrapers. Those were very interesting. We found some things that looked like engraving tools, too, things that are called gravers. And that was about it for the first couple of days. But then we sent those to a use-ware specialist, and he suggested that they were sort of typical of some Paleo-Indian tools. We did not have what you call the smoking gun until we were out for a third or a fourth day. So, it's pretty rare on the third or the fourth day of an archaeological excavation to find smoking guns. But we did. One of our younger volunteers, who was 7 at the time and was helping out, started a test pit And he then went off to go play in the river and look for salamanders. But we found a channel flake, and a channel flake is a really interesting. It's not a tool necessarily, but it's a flake that is removed from the production of a tool, a fluted projectile point. So think spear point that the Paleo-Indians are using. They only look like this during the Paleo-Indian period, and so we found that first channel flake, and then I think we're up to like 27 or 28 channel flakes now. We have a couple of point fragments that look like they have been fluted as well. Not traditional long fluted points, but the kinds that you see when a projectile point or a spear point breaks. Paleo-Indians were very frugal people. They moved huge distances across the landscape, hunting these herding animals, and so they reused a lot of their technology over and over again. And so when they broke a spear point, when they were butchering an animal or hunting an animal, they would then reuse it. And so it's a fashion called rebasing the tip. And so if the tip is still salvageable, they just sort of sit down and work on the projectile point a little bit more and use it. And that's what we have here. It looks like the Two Wrasslin Cat site is most likely a stopover site where there's a couple of different areas of activity where there's intense, tight activity focused on either the production of reusing projectile points, so you're pretty far away from those lithic sources that they like, so they're reusing their tools, or using the end scrapers to process animal hides. And we know that they were fresh hides based on the work by Logan Miller, our collaborator, who's done the use-wear for us on this site, as well as the Hollister site as well. And so we know a lot, actually, after only about 5 or 6 days of field work at this site. And we're all really excited for what's to come in May, because every day that we're out there, we have a new, really fantastic discovery. It's a great site.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, Dave, could you just kind of throw in a few words about that large rock and site furniture?
Sure. So there's also a really big boulder it's in the northern locus of the activity area. I think to date, we've probably got like 400 or so artifacts from that area, maybe 500. And there are not very many where that rock is. They're all sort of like sloped down it, indicating, and we didn't really we found like one or two under it. We did excavate under it as much as we could safely, suggesting that large boulder, which is sort of buried now, but was probably not as deeply buried 12,000, 11,000 years ago, was sort of site furniture, as Scott suggested. So it's a place where somebody sat and produced those spear points that I was talking about. That's where all the spear point technology is coming from. So probably very tight activity area. And this is something that we've seen at the Templeton site, too. That's a different site. This one is not alluvial. It's not buried deeply. It's on sort of the ground surface just because of the stratigraphy. But the Templeton site is buried very deeply. And a couple of years ago, we also found a large boulder where there were no artifacts sort of next to the boulder, but as you got around the boulder, there were about 100 or so artifacts that radiated out. Think the shatter patterns of artifacts as you're hitting with direct percussion on a larger core to make an artifact. Those artifacts, the flakes are springing away from the core from that hard percussion, and that's what we found at Templeton with Zach Singer, and that's what we found here too. So a really great window into where somebody sat and made those artifacts.
11 or 12,000 years ago.
Exactly. That is really something. Sarah, I think this question would be for you. How do you keep sites safe in between digs?
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge. I think that part of it is, I think, awareness. If people know that a site is there, particularly in their community, it's a place that they care about, they can become very protective of it. So they will chase people off and let people know if things like that are happening. I mean, not that looting doesn't happen, and it's always a risk when sites are available to the public and they're publicly located. But I think that part of it is just creating like a sense of shared heritage and community, and that this is like, all of our collective past and getting people involved. So that's like why we like to do a lot of public education and public outreach to talk about these sites and to get people invested in them and interested, and also for them to understand the significance and fragility of them. But, sometimes it is. Fortunately, this site is on private property. The Hollister site is on private property, so that affords them an extra level of protection.
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I think again that's a FOSA goal right? To get as many people involved and come out and join us for a day of archaeology, so that when you go back to where you're from, whatever town or wherever state where you live, you'll think about that in your backyard, because there's archaeology everywhere. Certainly Connecticut's loaded with sites.
Well, it's interesting because when you guys came to Ivoryton to do that dig, and we were so hopeful that you would find something, and you really didn't find anything of any significance at all. But just hearing you say that, Sarah, about people being invested in it, I know I would have protected it with my life if you had found something. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it's your backyard, and it's precious, and it's so interesting, and you want to learn so much that, we would have really protected it,
Archaeologists have a saying, even finding nothing tells you something.
Exactly.
Right?
I remember you teaching us that.
And people who aren't finding anything will often go to that saying. It's certainly a lot less fun than finding things.
It's like saying it's good luck when it rains on your
wedding.
wedding.
I was just going to say the same thing. It's like what everybody says when it rains at your wedding. Right. That's funny.
But again, the Ivoryton thing was interesting because it fit with what should have been there.
Right. Yes,
Yeah.
I remember you teaching us that as well.
Yeah.
So I'm going to close off Two Wrasslin Cats
Yes.
by saying that we're going to be out there for 2 days in May, on May 30th and 31st, and that actually coincides with the 10th anniversary of the coffee shop. And, it would be great for you to come out and have a cup of coffee and buy a sandwich and check out the archaeology.
And it's the best cat statue fountain in the state of Connecticut.
Yes. Oh, and you can pet cats there, too. There's a cat petting room,
Yeah.
so I would highly recommend it. So we only have a few minutes left, actually. We've talked through this entire hour already. But I really want to spend just a little bit of time talking about our other big summer project, which is our collaboration with the Digging into History program through the Connecticut State Library and the Connecticut Heritage Foundation, which is part of that. So this is the Digging into History project. It's like an educational program organized by the Connecticut State Library in collaboration with Seicheprey area of France. And back in 2019, they brought a group of Connecticut high school students to France to work on a World War I trench where a Connecticut regiment had fought. Now, after many, many years of COVID hiatus, we're finally being able to reciprocate, and a group of French students is going to come this July. And they are going to be working on an archaeological component with OSA and FOSA on a Rochambeau Revolutionary War campsite, because we wanted to find a site that had a French connection for them, since they had a Connecticut connection for our kids. So the students are going to be coming this July, and they're going to be working with us on a small archaeological project at the Bolton Heritage Farm in the town of Bolton, Connecticut, which was one of several campsites where French soldiers stopped on their way. They were making their way from Newport across Connecticut and New York and on the way to Yorktown for the Battle of Yorktown. And this was one of the campsites. And there's been some previous work done at the site back in the 90s by PAST. And they did some metal detecting. They were basically at that point trying to use the documents to locate the sites and the maps and to see if there's anything left of the archaeological materials related to these sites. And they did find that there was material here related to the French military. So, and there had been some concerns that this site had actually eroded away due to some later agricultural practices. But we went out and did a kind of survey to see if we could find a good spot to dig with the kids in the Digging into History program, and found a tremendous array of materials.
A holy cow moment.
Wow.
Yeah, so regimental buttons and some lead shot and things like that. So,
well, we had one. I don't know if you guys know this, but we had in the whole group who went to Seicheprey.
Yes.
Yeah, you knew that?
Yeah.
Christine Pitsley
exactly.
brought them in, and when they came back, we interviewed all of them, and they brought us something from the trench, which is right out there.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's in our glass case where people bring us little treasures. So you'll have to have them in. We'll have to make that arrangement.
Yeah.
If it's
that would be
possible.
great, and
we'd have to.
Yeah, so we did a metal detector survey to look for an area that might be good to do some excavations, and that was paired with GPR that Dave did with us. So I don't know if he wants to. We only have a minute or two, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that, how you're helping us to target an area.
Sure, real quick. So there was a massive, a very large metal detecting survey, and they found, as they mentioned, all sorts of really interesting regimental buttons, but there was some clustering of regimental buttons from the same regiment, too, as well as other sort of wagon parts and molten lead, too. Mm-hmm. And so when we did the GPR, we did a very large area, And it's a heavily plowed area, but what we found were a number, hundreds, it looks like hundreds of posts that go down into the soil. There's not really a lot of a pattern with most of them, which is what you might expect, right? If there's camping going on 4 or 5 different nights of people not camping necessarily in the same areas because it's regiments moving through, you would expect that to it's going to get swamped by overprinting, what an archaeologist might call a palimpsest of posts, right? Nothing that looks like fence posts from the farming either. We saw plow scars, but we did see a ring of circular posts of a very large, like 5 meter across, so think like 18 feet, maybe 20 feet across circular area where there were a couple of buttons and other metal fragments on the inside and one on the outside, which could be a really interesting area to dig, right? It could be a larger officer's style tent, or it's maybe some other larger camp tent that's not sort of the smaller one-person military tent. So I thought that it was a really fantastic day and potentially a really great window into, Connecticut's really prominent place in the Revolutionary War, right? And this connection with the French as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I don't think the French officers were sleeping in the little pup tents. So.
Yeah, and I should say that most of the officers were billeted across the street where the artillery was. So there would be less officers here.
Right,
We
this
know
would be the
from
infantry
documentary
camp.
evidence that this was the infantry camp, but there would still be some officers with them.
Right.
Yeah, so, we'll see what happens. We're going to target an area and do a little excavation. And, this is an archaeological preserve. This is a protected area, so we got permission and a permit to do this because of the educational value. And also because of the potential significance as we go into America 250 to have, another little story about Connecticut and the Revolutionary War.
Very exciting. Hey, Dave, thanks for joining us. So kind of
Sure,
you.
thanks for having
Thank
me.
you.
Thank you, Dave.
Yep.
So, man, that went fast.
Yeah, it's because we can't shut up about Hollister. Sorry.
So, it's the end of the show. Thank you for joining us. Hopefully you're interested in what we're doing this summer. If you're interested in FOSA, you can find us on Facebook, or you can reach us at FOSA, FOSA-CT.org.
And join us.
Yeah, join us.
Please.
If you want to learn more about our projects, you can check out osa.uconn.edu. There's a big spread on the Hollister site there and also our Facebook page.